Over the last decade, there's been a proliferation of superhero movies. We love to see the good guy or the wonderful woman save the world and to see the villain vanquished. Now, historians, psychologists, sociologists, anthropologists, they all tell us that these kind of hero stories are ubiquitous in human cultures. We seem to be hardwired for heroes. Sometimes our heroes are fictional guardians of the galaxy, and other times they're ordinary people who acted with great courage in extraordinary circumstances. Well, this whole reality of being hardwired for heroes is connected to the Gospels that speak to us about Jesus Christ. And that's what we're going to explore today. Welcome back to our series, Glory of the Gospels. I'm Thomas Smith. You know, each of the four Gospels approach our Lord from a different angle. Matthew, the most Jewish of our Gospels, shows that Jesus is the fulfillment of all the Old Testament messianic prophecies. Luke emphasizes that Jesus is the bringer of peace, of mercy, and of joy for the nations, while John focuses on Jesus' divine origin and identity. But it's Mark who reveals Jesus as a kind of action hero. Jesus is purposeful, he's determined, and he's on the move. Mark's gospel gives us a Jesus that is a warrior in a great battle. He's taking back ground for his Father from the god of this world, the devil. His first miracle in Mark's gospel is not a healing, but an exorcism. And Mark is famous for the imagery of Jesus as the one who has come into the world to bind the strong man, Satan, who's ransacked our earthly home. There's also an urgency in Mark's gospel that we don't find in the other gospel writers. In fact, the Greek term that we translate into English as immediately is used dozens of times in the opening chapters of Mark's gospel. Immediately Jesus did this. Immediately Jesus went there. It's a deliberate and powerful pacing, an urgent mission that Jesus is on, and he's heading to a specific location, Calvary. In fact, one author said that Jesus runs in Mark's gospel to his cross with the urgency of a lover to his beloved. Now, because Mark is the shortest of our gospels, sometimes people think that Mark is just Matthew light, since those two share a lot of the same stories and teachings, but Matthew is much bigger. But don't fall into that fallacy. Mark has amazing and unique information about the words and works of Jesus that make his gospel an exceptional window into our Lord's life. So in this session, we're going to introduce you a bit to the author of the gospel and the stunning source of his information. Now, Mark is one of those books that may never have been written except for the perfect alignment of circumstances and even conflict. So let's look at the issue of authorship and how this book came about. Our oldest surviving manuscripts of Mark's gospel are from the early 200s. These examples would be carefully copied versions of the original, and they were distributed widely to the many Christian communities in the Roman Empire. To give you some perspective on that dating, that the earliest texts we have are from around the 200s, let's turn to the science of textual criticism for a moment. If you look at the great Roman historians like Herodotus, the span between his lifetime, that is, the date of composition, and our earliest surviving manuscript is 1,300 years. And we only have about 8 copies of his histories. Or you've certainly heard of the Roman historian Tacitus, who is our source for much of Roman history in our history books today. The span between the composition of his work and our earliest surviving copy is 1,000 years, and we only have about 20 copies. When you look at the New Testament, in contrast, it's pretty remarkable. Here you have texts composed between 60 and 90 AD, and our earliest found partial manuscripts are as early as 130 AD. Intact, complete copies from the 300s. So in contrast to the great Roman histories that I mentioned, where we only have a handful of manuscripts that have survived, we have over 5,000 full or partial manuscripts of the Greek New Testament. We have 10,000 plus Latin translations of the Greek, 9,000 texts in other languages. All that to say, we have really good reason to be confident in the accuracy, the authenticity, and the integrity of our Gospels and the whole New Testament. Dr. Alistair McGrath, who is a professor of religion and science at Oxford University, has demonstrated this reliability of our biblical texts by comparing them to other historical records. So it's in that contrast that we see how remarkable it is that we have texts from Mark so early to his original source, in light of what we see with primary sources for other Roman and Greek history and events. So we know that we have some very early copies of Mark, but who wrote the original, what's often called the autograph? Well, regarding the Gospel of Mark, the earliest Christian writers, they're called church fathers, are in unanimous agreement. The author of Mark's Gospel, shouldn't surprise us, was a young man named John Mark, sometimes called Mark the Evangelist. Now, though he's not one of the 12 apostles, he's very closely associated with the first generation of followers. Let me give you some early examples supporting Mark and authorship. Clement of Rome, who's one of the first bishops of Rome, ordained by Peter and Paul, alludes to Mark in around 95 AD. The church father Papias, who was born only 30 years after Christ's resurrection, records that the apostle John, whom Papias knew, spoke of the gospel that Mark wrote and who Mark got his facts from. More on that later. A few decades after Papias, Clement of Alexander, Irenaeus, Tertullian, Origen, and sources as far-flung as France and North Africa are all in agreement of Markan authorship. Now, Mark is mentioned in both the Acts of the Apostles and in the letters of St. Paul and Peter. He was a Jewish believer in Jesus. His mother, also named Mary, owned a home in Jerusalem that was large enough for early followers of Jesus to gather in. You can see that in Acts chapter 12. Some even believe that her home may have been the upper room. Now, in Acts 13, young John Mark joins Paul in his missionary journeys. For an unknown reason, John Mark leaves that missionary service. We don't know the specific circumstances, but it's clear it wasn't a positive parting. And apparently, early Paul didn't have a lot of patience for defectors. It was a one-strike, you're out policy. Because when Mark later asked to rejoin the missionary efforts, Paul refused him, and that led to a sharp disagreement between Paul and Barnabas. Thankfully, Barnabas said, "I'll take Mark under my wing." So it's fitting that his name, Barnabas, means son of encouragement, because that's what we always see Joseph, later named Barnabas, doing. He will actually introduce Mark to another apostle who will be Mark's new mentor and Mark's source for the gospel. Barnabas, I suppose, reasoned Mark may not be ready for the streets, but let's find him a good desk job. And Mark is going to become the scribe of St. Peter in the city of Rome. Peter will call Mark his spiritual son in his first encyclical, 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 13. And in light of growing persecution at the time and at the urging really of Christians in Rome, Mark began to record the words and the works of Jesus as preached publicly by Peter. So the first key to reading and really enjoying Mark is to do it with Peter in mind. Note when you read this gospel the unique Petrine moments and the details that only Mark gives us. This is a gospel with details that only a very intimate eyewitness of Jesus could give us. Now, as an interesting side note, go and read Peter's sermons in the Acts of the Apostles, especially Acts chapter 10. And there are some really neat similarities to the structure of the Gospel of Matthew and that sermon. And I think that further confirms the Petrine or Peter foundation of this gospel. In fact, the Gospel of Mark was also called the Memoirs of St. Peter in early Christianity. Now, as you read the gospel with that in mind, it makes even more meaningful sense of why Mark highlights certain aspects of the life of Jesus. You're discovering who Jesus is through the eyes of fallible Peter, whose faith flags and even dramatically fails before he becomes one of the great pillars of faith for the early church. So you'll get in Mark's gospel some interesting details connected to Peter. Let me give you some examples. There are no infancy narratives in Mark like Matthew and Luke. Events like the baptism of Jesus and the wilderness temptation get only a sentence or two at the beginning. In Mark's gospel, Jesus heads immediately to the Galilee, and his very first act, it's not a miracle, but the calling of Simon, who will later be called Peter, and his brother Andrew. Of course, both of them were fishermen. Simon's not only the first apostle mentioned in Mark, but he's also the very last apostle in Mark 16. So Simon Peter forms kind of bookends of this gospel. It's also interesting that Mark never refers to him as Simon Peter. He always refers to him as Simon until Jesus changes his name to Peter, a detail that you can see Peter wanting Mark to use. In contrast, in the Gospel of Mark, of John, he's always called Simon Peter. In fact, 17 times. Now, I mentioned the first miracle in Mark is exorcism, but the first healing Mark mentions is also related to Peter. It's the healing of Peter's mother-in-law. Now, for those of you who like mother-in-law jokes, Archbishop Fulton Sheen muses that this was the least appreciated and welcomed miracle of Jesus in the Gospels. Peter wasn't too happy about his mother-in-law being healed. Now, chapter 1 also indicates that Jesus makes Peter's home his own while he's ministering in the Galilee. As an archaeological aside, that first century stone home of Peter was discovered in the 1960s in Capernaum. It had been buried under rubble caused by earthquakes and invasions and time. And surrounding that little first century house were ancient churches built in the 400s and the 700s to protect this sacred space connected to Jesus. This is the home, by the way, where the crowds bring people to be healed, and the roof is removed by 4 friends who lower their buddy down to Jesus to be healed. Now, what's really interesting is the primary moments you see Peter in this gospel, he's falling down, he's failing, he's missing the mark. It speaks to Peter's great humility that you don't get, for example, the extended conversations where Jesus calls Peter the rock upon which he'll build a church, like we do in Matthew 16. But instead, it shows his humanity and his weakness. By the time Mark is composing the gospel, it's important to kind of realize that Peter is a pillar of the church. He's founded churches throughout the empire and now the church in Rome. And he's already likely composed 2 letters, which are 1st and 2nd Peter, early encyclicals. So it would have been tempting to imagine that Peter was always firm in his faith, always a great pillar. And here's Peter's chance to leave history a flattering portrait of his faithfulness. But surprisingly, of all the 4 Gospels, the Gospel of Mark paints the most unflattering portrait of Peter. Maybe Peter wanted the new Christians, very likely facing difficulty, he wanted them to know that even at one point he was fearful. At one point his faith flagged, and that he had to mature and grow in faith just like them. Now let me share with you a couple of other nuggets. Ancient manuscripts were expensive to produce, being handwritten. So telling a story briefly as possible was very crucial. Every word counted. But in spite of that, this very short gospel, you can read it in about 40 minutes, has lots of little details that you would think would be unimportant. But Mark includes them. The kind of things that only an eyewitness and companion of the Lord would share. For example, while Matthew will speak of Jesus calming the storm after they awaken him in the boat, only Mark tells us that Jesus was in the stern of the ship on the cushion, a very specific cushion. Now that's a detail a fisherman, and presumably the owner of that boat, would share. Only in Mark do we get the nickname of John and James, Peter's fellow fishermen, as the sons of thunder. We get vivid details about the condition of the demonic-possessed man in the tombs that Jesus will heal, something only an eyewitness would note. We get more about the inner life and physical effects of ministry on Jesus in Mark than any of the other Gospels. We see Jesus sighing deeply, moved with pity, marveling at others' unbelief, and moved by righteous anger or indignation. In fact, that's 3 times in Mark's Gospel, chapter 3, chapter 8, chapter 11. We find him fatigued and hungry. It's the only gospel also to tell us that Jesus loved the rich young ruler who walked away from Christ's call to follow him on the way. These are just a few examples of what makes this a uniquely Petrine gospel, truly the memoirs of a close and intimate disciple of Jesus Christ. Now, in our next session, we're going to talk about the structure of this gospel and its unusual beginning and end, and how Mark arranges this gospel to present a very powerful portrait of Jesus. So I hope to see you next time as we continue to explore the glory of the Gospels.